Welcome to the History Maps podcast. A Roman general brings 35,000 of the world's most elite, heavily armored infantry into the deserts of the ancient Middle East.
Right.
And they march in these interlocking squares, shields raised, completely expecting a traditional grinding battle of attrition.
Which is how they always fought.
Exactly. But suddenly those legions are just completely dismantled. They are choked by this suffocating, artificially created cloud of dust, and they're battered by a continuous hail of armor-piercing arrows.
Right, and systematically cut down by a nomadic cavalry that simply refuses to play by Mediterranean rules.
It's wild. Today we're undertaking a deep dive into the Persian history series, focusing comprehensively on the Parthian Empire. We're looking at a state that reigned from 247 BCE all the way to 224 CE.
And our objective here is to map out exactly how a nomadic tribe from the Central Asian steppes built this enduring empire that rivaled Rome.
Yeah, and secured an absolute chokehold on the Silk Road.
Exactly, and operated on a highly decentralized system that really challenges our basic definitions of what imperial power even looks like.
So you will discover how the Parthians blended Hellenistic, Persian, and nomadic cultures into a totally unique political machine. And perhaps more importantly, we're going to unpack why the historical record is just so heavily biased against them.
It really is. I mean, to figure out how they became the boogeyman of the Roman Empire, we have to look entirely outside the traditional centers of urban civilization.
Right, we're starting out on the steppe.
Yes, east of the Caspian Sea with a group called the Parni.
The Parni. So who exactly were they?
So the Parni were an Iranian nomadic tribe. They were part of a much larger confederation known as the Dahe. And it's crucial to understand their environment here.
Because they weren't city builders, right?
No, not at all. They were pastoral nomads. Their entire society was tied to the seasonal migration of their herds, their mastery of horsemanship, and just the vast open plains. And they existed right on the fringes of the Seleucid Empire.
Which was the massive Hellenistic Greek state that had, gobbled up Alexander the Great's eastern conquests.
Right. So they're essentially just looking over the fence at this massive, wealthy, urbanized empire. And around 250 BCE, these Parni nomads, led by a chieftain named Arsaces I, they start moving south.
They penetrate a district called Astoin. But why then? Why push into Seleucid territory at that specific moment?
It was sheer opportunism, really. The Seleucid Empire was suffocating under severe internal strife. They had revolts breaking out in their eastern provinces, specifically in Bactria.
Right.
And simultaneously, they're getting bogged down in these brutal, draining conflicts with Ptolemaic Egypt over in the west.
So the central authority in Antioch was totally distracted.
Distracted, overextended, and bleeding cash.
Which leaves the back door wide open for Arsaces.
Exactly. And by 247 BCE, he's officially proclaimed king at a fortress called Osek.
Which initiates what we now call the Arsacid era.
Right. But they don't just stay in that fortress. About a decade later, around 238 BCE, Arsaces I leads a massive invasion into the Seleucid province of Parthia itself.
And the timing on that is just immaculate.
Oh, it's perfect. Because the local Seleucid governor of Parthia, a man named Andragoras, had actually just rebelled against the Seleucid king.
So Andragoras is completely cut off from central support.
Yes. Arsaces sweeps in, defeats Andragoras, kills him, and just seizes the province.
So suddenly the Parni are no longer just nomads raiding the frontiers for cattle and grain.
No, they possess a major, heavily fortified administrative province. They transition virtually overnight from raiders to the rulers of a sedentary, urbanized society.
And this is where they pull off this brilliant political maneuver. Because they don't just burn the cities down and turn the province into a massive horse pasture.
Right, they adapt to it.
They adopt the local Parthian language as the official court language, using it alongside Middle Persian, Aramaic, and Greek. It makes me think of a corporate franchise acquisition.
Oh, how
Well, you have this scrappy, aggressive startup that buys out a massive, established regional distributor. The new leadership doesn't throw away the old company's branding, right? They keep the name on the building because of the local brand recognition.
That franchise acquisition model is actually a perfect way to look at it.
Because the Parni essentially adopts the identity of their conquest. They become the Parthians.
Yes. They needed immediate legitimacy to rule over a settled population that was totally accustomed to Persian and Hellenistic administration. They capitalized on the Seleucid distractions and really began synthesizing their nomadic identity with established systems.
And we see this deliberately and how every single subsequent king of this empire adopts the name Arsaces as a dynastic title.
Cementing that original founder's brand, just like every Roman emperor taking the name Caesar.
Right. And you can actually see this transition happening in real time if you look at the early coinage of Arsaces I.
The numismatic evidence is fascinating here.
Yeah, his first silver coins, the drachms, were direct, unapologetic imitations of Hellenistic Seleucid currency. They featured diademed busts on the front and an enthroned figure on the back, modeled explicitly on the Greek god Apollo.
But slowly, over his reign, they start integrating Iranian motifs.
Like the tiara.
Exactly. The nomadic tiara suddenly appears on the king's head on the coinage. It's a highly calculated visual signal to a very diverse population.
So they're basically telling their Greek subjects, we respect the Hellenistic forms of commerce, your money is still good.
While simultaneously telling their Iranian subjects, we are returning to an indigenous traditional form of kingship.
Right. And once that brand identity is secured in Parthia, they start expanding.
And they expand rapidly. We see massive territorial growth, primarily under Mithridates I, who ruled from 171 to 132 BCE.
He sweeps down and conquers Mesopotamia and Persis, taking Parthia from a regional nuisance to a bona fide empire.
And following his groundwork, we eventually get to Mithridates II, ruling from 124 to 91 BCE. He's the ruler who officially resurrects the old Achaemenid title, King of Kings.
Which is a monumental shift.
Yeah.
It establishes the Arsacids as the very first indigenous Iranian dynasty to hold that specific supreme level of power since Alexander the Great shattered the Persian Empire centuries prior.
That's a huge claim to legitimacy.
But hold on, I need to stop you there because the logistics of tracking this history seem completely maddening.
They are.
If every single king takes the exact same regnal name, Arsaces, and none of their early coins have calendar dates stamped on them, how is it even possible for historians to build a definitive timeline?
It's incredibly difficult.
Aren't they just guessing? Like, how do we know we aren't accidentally merging two different guys into one king or splitting one king into two?
It's actually one of the most contentious debates in the field of ancient history because we lack comprehensive royal annals written by the Parthians themselves, numismatics.
Which is the study of coins, right?
Yes. The deep forensic study of coins has to serve as our primary historical framework. For decades, the traditional timeline we all used was established by a scholar named David Selwood, and his entire chronology relies on the subtle evolution of coin iconography.
So he's looking at what? The outfits.
Exactly. He looked at the style of the beards, the specific type of crowns, the slight shifts in how the Greek title for Arsaces was inscribed around the rim, and he built a sequence of rulers based entirely on those visual changes in fashion and metallurgy over time.
Okay, but relying on the length of a beard on a piece of silver to determine imperial succession feels incredibly fragile.
It is fragile, which is why a revised chronology was recently proposed by Golem Reza F. Chaksir. He takes a much wider approach.
What does he use?
He incorporates surviving cuneiform sources from Babylon, specifically ancient astronomical diaries and economic texts that sometimes mention the reigning king by his personal name alongside planetary movements.
That's clever.
Right. And he cross-references those Babylonian texts with alternative interpretations of those same coins. And this leads to massive disputes.
I can imagine.
For instance, Asar identifies a glaring gap in Selwood's timeline and proposes the existence of an unknown king II, reigning right between Artabanus I and Mithridates II.
Wait, unknown king II. What is the actual evidence for a phantom king just wedged in there?
It comes down to a specific set of coins depicting a youthful, completely beardless ruler. Selwood traditionally attributed these to a young Mithridates II.
Okay.
But Asar argues that the established coins of Artabanus I and the later coins of Mithridates II all feature older, fully bearded men with very specific facial structures.
So Asar concludes it makes no biological or political sense for a young beardless boy to rule between them.
Exactly, unless he is an entirely separate, previously unidentified king who held the throne briefly.
That is next-level historical detective work. Just staring at the facial hair on a silver dram to prove the existence of a human being who ruled millions of people.
It really is.
And because of this, the guy Selwood calls Mithridates III is actually referred to as Mithridates IV by Asar, just because Asar slides another guy into the lineup.
Right, it shifts everything.
It really drives home how murky the internal political workings of this empire are.
It does. But while their internal chronology is a constant debate among academics, their external economic impact is completely indisputable.
because of the territory they held.
Yes, this vast territorial expansion under kings like Mithridates I and II wasn't just an exercise in painting the map. It deliberately positioned the Arsacids to control the single most lucrative economic artery of the ancient world.
Right, because once they take Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, they are physically sitting right on top of the Silk Road.
Exactly.
The Parthians essentially functioned as the mandatory intermediaries in the Eurasian trade networks. They are the unavoidable geographic toll booth between Han China and the Roman Empire.
And official state-level trade relations with Han China opened up around 121 BCE. This was the direct result of the famous diplomatic missions of the Chinese envoy Zhang Qian, who traveled west to map out the territories beyond the Himalayas.
Okay, so once those physical routes were established and secured, the Parthians realized the sheer scale of the gold mine they were sitting on.
They absolutely did.
They didn't just facilitate the transit of goods, they aggressively taxed the Eurasian caravan trade.
And we're talking about the ultimate luxury goods of antiquity. You have Chinese silk, Indian spices, pearls, and high-grade Indian iron constantly flowing west toward Rome.
Meanwhile, you have Roman luxury glassware, Mediterranean wine, and precious metals flowing east toward China.
And the Parthians are taking a heavy percentage of all of it. They even had these semi-autonomous caravan cities operating under their umbrella.
Like Palmyra and Atra.
Exactly. Which amplified this income by levying their own regional customs fees on top of the royal taxes.
So the Parthians engaged in highly calculated economic strategies to maintain that monopoly. Their entire economic engine relied on being the exclusive middleman.
Therefore, it became a matter of state security to actively prevent any direct contact between the Roman Empire, which the Chinese referred to as Dakin,
Right.
and the Han Empire, known as Anxi.
But logistically, how do you actually do that?
Yeah.
How do you keep two massive, heavily resourced empires from talking to each other for centuries?
It takes effort.
If Rome wants silk and China wants Roman glass, how did the Parthians stop them from just building ships or charting new routes to bypass the toll booths?
They achieved it through a strict combination of absolute geographical control and very deliberate state-sponsored misinformation.
What's this information?
Yes. Geographically, the Parthians controlled the narrow, vital land corridors through Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau.
Yeah.
Any overland caravan physically had to pass through their territory and stop at their way station.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the psychological control they exerted over the flow of information is even more compelling.
And there is a very specific event from 97 CE that illustrates this perfectly. The Han general Ban Chao is out west, and he dispatches a military envoy named Gan Ying with express orders to travel all the way to Rome to finally make direct contact.
Right.
So Gan Ying travels thousands of miles, makes it all the way to the Persian Gulf or the Euphrates River, which is essentially the westernmost edge of Parthian territory. He's right on the doorstep of the Roman world.
And that is precisely where the Parthian frontier agents intercept him.
But they don't arrest him. They don't use violence.
No, instead, they sit him down and deliberately dissuade him by wildly exaggerating the perils of the final leg of the journey.
It's brilliant.
They tell this land-based Chinese envoy that the sea voyage to Rome is treacherous, that could take up to 2 full years if the winds are bad.
And then they add this psychological twist. They tell him the ocean induces such severe supernatural homesickness that men literally throw themselves overboard or die from melancholy.
They essentially look a hardened diplomat in the eye and say, "You will die of sadness if you get on this boat."
And the craziest part is that it works. Gan Ying turns around, travels all the way back to China, and reports to the Han court that Rome is simply too dangerous and distant to reach directly.
The Parthians preserved their total monopoly without firing a single arrow.
And they didn't just control the routes, they actively manipulated the products. You have these records of the Parthians buying up massive shipments of imported Chinese silk fabrics, bringing them into their own cities, and completely unraveling the threads.
Yes, the practice of unraveling and reweaving. By taking Chinese silk and reweaving it domestically into different Persian-style patterns or garments, they completely obscured the origin of the material from the Roman buyers at the other end of the supply chain.
Because the Romans were completely obsessed with silk, right? It was a status symbol that drained their silver reserves.
Absolutely. But they didn't actually understand how it was made or where exactly it came from. By processing it domestically, the Parthians could sustain astronomical markups. They were selling a finished branded product rather than just acting as a delivery service.
So if you have this river of immense wealth flowing through your territory, how do you actually govern the land and the people generating it?
It requires a unique approach.
Right, because you're managing a geography spanning from the Euphrates River in modern Iraq all the way to the borders of Central Asia. That requires an administrative system that is completely alien to the rigid top-down centralization we see in Rome or Han China.
Which leads us right into how their society functioned, which was essentially a massive feudal confederation.
Let's unpack that.
When we define Parthia as a feudal monarchy, we're describing a highly decentralized ecosystem of power. The King of Kings sat on the throne, but he ruled alongside a vast, entrenched network of semi-autonomous vassal kings and immensely powerful noble clans.
This is a stark, fundamental contrast to the Romans. They sent appointed bureaucrats from the capital on temporary assignments to rule their provinces directly.
Exactly. But in Parthia, the records specifically highlight the 7 great houses, families like the House of Surin in the east or the House of Karen in the north.
These were not just wealthy politicians lingering around the capital.
No, these families held permanent, hereditary control over massive regional satrapies. They operated almost like independent nations within the empire.
They maintained their own formidable private armies and collected their own local taxes.
And the society functioning beneath them was rigidly stratified. You have the King of Kings and the royal court at the absolute apex. Beneath them is the nobility, known as the Azat, which is anchored by those great houses.
Then you have the vast majority of the population, the commoners, which included farmers, merchants, and artisans.
And at the very bottom, a substantial population of slaves, typically sourced from warfare, raiding, or debt bondage.
So if you're living in this empire, your daily reality looks completely different depending on your zip code and your class.
Very different.
The elites are living in these sprawling urban villas, complete with massive courtyards and brightly decorated halls in administrative centers like Ctesiphon or Nisa.
Meanwhile, if you're a commoner in the rural areas, you're living in mud brick or stone houses near the river valleys, you're focusing heavily on agriculture, growing wheat, barley, and managing orchards.
Or, if you're up in the highlands, you're engaging in pastoralism, herding massive flocks of sheep and breeding the famous Parthian horses.
Right. Now, this deeply decentralized nature is frequently criticized by classical Greco-Roman historians who viewed it through their own administrative lens as a fatal weakness.
Because the Parthians utilized a lump sum tribute system. Instead of the meticulous house-by-house land surveys and direct taxation that the previous empires used, the Parthian king essentially operated on a macro level.
Yes, he told a regional lord, "Send me this specific tonnage of silver and grain every year, and I will not interfere in how you manage your local courts or your local infrastructure."
Okay, but if you look at that franchise model objectively, doesn't a system where local lords have their own private armies and collect their own taxes just breed constant rebellion?
That's the classical critique, yes.
Doesn't that fundamentally castrate the power of the king, leaving him constantly hostage to the whims of warlords who could, unite and overthrow him on a Tuesday?
It definitely created a precarious political balance, and yes, it did lead to periods of severe dynastic infighting. However, it was also a ruthlessly pragmatic adaptation to their reality.
How so?
The Parthian domain was incredibly heterogeneous. You had vastly different cultures, languages, religions, and brutal topographies spanning thousands of miles. A rigid, centralized bureaucracy would have simply collapsed under the logistical weight of trying to micromanage such a diverse space.
Especially given the slow communication speeds of antiquity.
Exactly. By delegating power and wealth, the Arsacids ensured that local lords were deeply financially invested in defending their own borders against nomadic incursions or Roman legions. That flexibility is exactly what sustained imperial cohesion for nearly 5 centuries.
It wasn't strictly a boys' club at the top of that hierarchy either, right?
No, it wasn't. While intensely patriarchal norms dominated the society,
Men were trained essentially from birth to be warriors and horsemen.
noble women could and did wield immense political and economic influence. The most striking example of this is Queen Musa, who completely shattered the mold by co-ruling the empire around 2 BCE to 2 CE.
Queen Musa's trajectory is one of the most compelling stories of the ancient world. She was originally an enslaved Italian woman.
Right.
She was actually given to the Parthian king Phraates IV as a diplomatic gift by the Roman Emperor Augustus.
And through sheer political acumen, she maneuvered her way from a diplomatic token into becoming his favored primary wife.
She then convinced the king to send his older legitimate sons away to Rome under the guise of hostages to guarantee a peace treaty.
Which conveniently cleared the line of succession for her own son.
And once the path was clear, she allegedly poisoned Phraates IV.
She did. She then ruled jointly with her son, Phraates V. Her portrait even appears on official Parthian coinage right alongside his, which is an incredibly rare assertion of female power in this region.
It perfectly illustrates that within this decentralized feudal structure, power was fluid enough for a formerly enslaved foreign woman to orchestrate a coup and ascend to the throne of a superpower.
Or it really does.
But political maneuvering only gets you so far. The true test of this decentralized system and the ultimate check on the loyalty of those powerful noble houses was on the battlefield.
Which brings us to the necessity of defending all this wealth.
Right. If you're delegating power, how do you fight a centralized threat like Rome?
Well, the Parthian military structure is a direct mirror of their feudal society. They completely lacked a professional standing army in the Roman sense.
There were no career soldiers garrisoned in stone forts, drilling every day, waiting for orders from the capital.
Instead, they relied entirely on the noble levies. When the King of Kings decided to go to war, he sent a royal summons to the great houses. Those franchise-owning nobles were contractually obligated to mobilize their private regional armies and march them to a designated mustering point.
And the army that showed up to that mustering point was almost entirely cavalry. The Parthians designed their military specifically for the sprawling, arid terrains of the Middle East and the Iranian plateau. They looked at the prevailing military wisdom of the Mediterranean world, which relied on massive blocks of heavy infantry, like the Greek phalanx or the Roman legion, grinding into each other.
And they completely rejected it.
Right. The Parthians prioritized extreme mobility, range, and evasion over direct physical confrontation.
This cavalry force was divided into two highly specialized branches. First, you have the cataphracts, which made up roughly 10 to 20% of the force.
These are the heavy shock cavalry, drawn exclusively from the ultra-wealthy aristocracy, simply because the required equipment was staggeringly expensive.
Both the rider and his massive, specially bred horse were completely enveloped in overlapping metal scale or lamellar armor.
They must have looked like literal iron statues moving across the desert.
Pretty much. And they wielded a massive heavy lance called a contos that they used for devastating shock charges. They would ride straight into an enemy infantry line specifically to shatter their cohesion.
But the absolute core of the army, the other 80 to 90%, were the horse archers.
The horse archers were the light cavalry, drawn from the commoner class. They wore simple tunics and trousers, devoid of heavy armor, which allowed their lighter horses to maintain incredible speed and stamina.
And their primary instrument of war was the composite recurve bow.
Let's talk about the mechanics of this bow, because it is an absolute engineering marvel.
Yeah, you aren't just carving a piece of wood here.
No, it's a highly complex weapon made by laminating layers of wood, animal sinew, and horn, all bound together with specialized glues and cured over months.
These bows had an estimated draw weight of anywhere from 100 to 160 pounds.
Which is massive.
For a modern context, a standard hunting bow used today to take down large game usually has a draw weight of around 50 to 70 pounds. These ancient archers were firing heavy arrows with such immense kinetic energy that they were lethal well beyond 300 meters.
And the tactical doctrine they developed around these two distinct units was a masterpiece of combined arms.
How do they coordinate them?
The heavy cataphracts would apply terrifying frontal pressure, lining up as if to charge. This threat forced the enemy infantry to pack themselves tightly together, locking their shields for defense against the lance.
So they bunch up.
But once the enemy was bunched up into a tight, immobile block, the light horse archers would encircle them and unleash continuous plunging volleys of arrows into the massed ranks.
And if the enemy infantry got frustrated, broke their defensive formation, and tried to charge the archers on foot,
the archers would simply spur their horses and ride away.
which is the origin of the famous Parthian shot.
Exactly. These riders were trained from childhood to ride bareback, guiding the horse with their knees so their hands were totally free.
At a full gallop, running away from the enemy, they would twist completely backward in the saddle and accurately fire heavy arrows right into the faces of their pursuers.
You think you've finally chased them off the field, you drop your shield to run, and suddenly you take a metal-tipped arrow through the chest.
It was a psychological and tactical nightmare for traditional infantry.
However, this extreme specialization came with a severe, distinct weakness. Because they invested everything into cavalry and lacked robust infantry or specialized engineering corps, The Parthians were notoriously inept at siege warfare.
So they could absolutely annihilate an army in the open desert. But if that same army managed to retreat behind the stone walls of a fortified city, the Parthian cavalry would basically just sit outside, largely useless.
Exactly. They were the ancient equivalent of a highly specialized modern strike team. If you have a squad trained exclusively for deepwater oceanic combat, they are untouchable in the ocean.
Right, but if you drop that exact same squad into a dense jungle canopy with no specialized gear, they are going to fail.
The Parthians were masters of open desert kinetic warfare, but entirely unsuited for a protracted, grinding urban siege.
And we see this exact dynamic, their absolute mastery of the open field, play out in their most famous military victory, the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE.
This is the textbook example of Parthian military doctrine completely dismantling a traditional Western superpower.
The Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, marched into Mesopotamia with roughly 35,000 heavy Roman legionaries, expecting a glorious, straightforward conquest.
He was met near the town of Carrhae by a Parthian general named Serena, who was the head of the powerful House of Surin.
And Serena does not bring a massive, sprawling horde to fight Crassus. He brings a tightly disciplined, highly specialized force, 10,000 horse archers and 1,000 heavy cataphracts.
The Romans outnumber them more than 3-1.
When the battle lines are drawn, the Romans form up into a massive, interlocking defensive square, shields facing outward on all sides. They completely expect the Parthians to eventually charge and break themselves against the Roman shield wall.
But Serena refuses to play by Roman rules. He holds his heavy cataphracts back, just out of range, keeping the threat alive. Then he sends his 10,000 horse archers to completely surround the Roman square.
And they begin this relentless, unmerciful bombardment of arrows. The Romans, huddled under their shields, assume they just have to wait it out.
Because basic logistics suggests that 10,000 archers will eventually empty their quivers, and then the Romans can advance.
But Serena had brought an innovation. He had organized a dedicated logistics train of thousands of camels positioned just behind his lines, loaded entirely with massive bundles of fresh arrows.
The archers would empty their quivers into the Roman square, ride back to the camel train, immediately reload, and return to the firing line. It was an endless, mechanized hail of armor-piercing projectiles.
To compound the terror, Serena used the dry environment itself as a weapon. He ordered his light cavalry to ride rapidly in tight circles around the Roman formation, their horses' hooves kicking up a massive, suffocating dust cloud.
The Romans were blinded. They were choking on the dust, unable to see where the next volley was coming from.
And they were forced to tighten their formation even further just to maintain contact with the man next to them.
Which made them a completely unmissable, stationary target for the arrows plunging down from above.
The psychological toll must have been unbearable. Eventually, Crassus is forced to act, and he orders his son, Publius, to lead a desperate counterattack with the Roman auxiliary cavalry and a detachment of infantry.
The Parthian light horse executes a flawless, feigned retreat. They immediately run away, drawing Publius and his men far away from the safety of the main infantry body.
Once Publius is isolated in the desert, the heavy cataphracts suddenly wheel around, drop their lances, and completely obliterate his detachment.
Crassus's entire army is systematically, clinically dismantled. 35,000 Romans marched into the desert. Only a fraction ever made it back to Syria.
It was a stunning, epoch-defining demonstration of kinetic energy and mobility triumphing over sheer mass and static defense.
And we actually have stark physical evidence of the violence these specific weapons inflicted. A recent archaeological excavation in 225 CE at the Liarsengban cemetery in northwestern Iran uncovered the skeleton of a male warrior from the Parthian era.
The details on this skeleton are wild. Archaeologists found an iron arrowhead driven deeply right into the tibia, the lower leg bone.
But what makes it incredible is that CT scans show significant prolonged bone regrowth wrapping all the way around the iron.
This means this warrior didn't die on the battlefield that day. He survived a severe, penetrating bone injury, likely self-treated the wound, and lived for years, walking around with a piece of enemy shrapnel literally fused into his leg.
It gives you a highly visceral sense of the brutal physical realities of ancient combat that written sources often gloss over.
It truly grounds the history in human suffering and resilience. But it's important to remember that they weren't just warriors.
Right.
When you combine the immense steady wealth flowing from the Silk Road tolls with a military machine capable of securing your borders against Rome, you generate a massive cultural surplus. The Parthians used that wealth to physically reshape the cities they ruled, funding a rich cultural renaissance.
Initially, when the Arsacids first took power, they were very careful to appease their new subjects. The historical records describe their early culture as exhibiting Philhellenism.
A distinct love and patronage of Greek culture.
Exactly. They minted their coins with Greek inscriptions, they heavily funded Greek theater and gymnasiums in the urban centers. But as the centuries pass and their power cements, we see a gradual, deliberate Iranian revival.
Under later kings, like Vologases I, they start actively shedding the Greek nomenclature and artistic styles, leaning heavily into their indigenous Iranian roots.
You see this shift most clearly in the evolution of Parthian art. If you look at earlier Hellenistic art, it heavily favored profile views. Faces of gods and kings are shown from the side, looking off into the distance.
But Parthian art becomes distinctly characterized by strict frontal figural representation.
Basically, their statues stare right through you.
Whether it's a painting or a rock relief, the subjects are oriented forward, making direct, unbroken eye contact with the viewer. It projects a very different, almost confrontational kind of psychological authority and presence compared to the aloofness of Greek art.
Exactly. And this cultural synthesis was heavily concentrated in their major urban centers. Cities like Nisa, their early capital in what is now modern Turkmenistan,
Ctesiphon, the sprawling metropolis right on the Tigris River.
and the great fortified caravan city of Hatra. And in these cities, they pioneered architectural innovations that changed the structural landscape of the Middle East forever.
They perfected the use of pitch brick vaults that could be constructed without the need for wooden centering.
And they developed the Iwan, which is a massive vaulted hall walled on 3 sides and completely open to the elements on the 4th.
I have to ask about the engineering of this. How does an originally nomadic people manage to pioneer major sedentary architectural techniques like the vaulted Iwan?
It's a great question.
Like, how does a culture whose foundational roots are tied to living in mobile tents on horseback suddenly transition to engineering massive, unsupported brick arches that manage to survive for millennia?
It's a testament to their administrative pragmatism and their deep pockets. The Parthian kings didn't necessarily draft the blueprints or lay the mud bricks themselves. They acted as visionary patrons.
They accumulated vast reserves of wealth from the Silk Road and used it to sponsor the best local Mesopotamian and Iranian craftsmen.
The Parthians provided the funding and the grand vision. They often demanded massive, open interior spaces that likely recalled the open plains and vast tents of their nomadic past, and they challenged the local engineers to make it a reality using indigenous mud brick technology.
So they didn't invent the brick. They synthesized the local tech with their own cultural aesthetic.
Furthermore, building pitched brick vaults without wooden scaffolding wasn't just a stylistic quirk. It was a necessary adaptation to a desert landscape where large timber for scaffolding was incredibly scarce.
And these massive barrel vaults, like the ones found at the city of Assur, were incredibly resilient to the seismic activity that constantly shakes the region.
The ultimate surviving expression of this ambition is the Ta'i Khazra, or the Arch of Ctesiphon.
It features a massive ribbed vault construction that still stands today as one of the largest single-span, unreinforced brick arches in the entire world. It is a breathtaking piece of engineering.
But their patronage wasn't limited to monumental architecture. If you look at the excavations at Old Nisa, archaeologists uncovered dozens of these intricately carved ivory raita.
Raitas are highly elaborate ceremonial drinking vessels.
And the ones discovered at Nisa are spectacular pieces of art. They are shaped like large horns, painstakingly carved from imported elephant ivory, and they can stand up to 1 meter high.
The base of the horn typically ends in these fantastic mythical animal figures like winged lion griffins.
They beautifully blend the stark realism of Greco-Bactrian carving techniques with deep, ancient Iranian religious and royal symbolism. They were likely used in elite royal banquets, passed around by the nobility to display their immense wealth and cosmopolitan tastes.
And then you have the city of Hatra. This wasn't just a dusty trading post. It was a masterpiece of urban defense.
It was built in a massive circular or oval pattern, completely surrounded by thick mud brick and stone walls that stood up to 20 meters high, complete with a deep defensive moat.
It was such an impregnable fortress that it successfully repelled multiple full-scale Roman sieges led by emperors who just gave up and went home.
And that exact same blending of cultures we see in the physical architecture, the Greek realism mixed with Iranian scale, bleeds right over into how they viewed the universe.
The Parthian Empire was incredibly diverse, and the religious landscape reflects a highly inclusive, heavily syncretic system that allowed wildly different beliefs to coexist peacefully.
The Parthians practiced very broad religious tolerance. If you were a Jewish merchant living in Babylon, an early Christian setting up a community in Mesopotamia, or a Greek colonist worshiping Apollo in the western provinces, the Parthian government largely left you alone to practice your own traditions.
The main belief systems floating around the empire were the traditional Greek pantheon, indigenous Zoroastrianism, and the rising cult of Mithraism.
And there was heavy syncretism, which is the blending and merging of different gods into single figures.
Yes, the boundaries between the deities became highly fluid and localized. For instance, the supreme Greek god Zeus was frequently equated with the supreme Zoroastrian deity Ahura Mazda,
The Greek sun god Apollo was heavily associated with the Iranian deity Mithra.
and the Greek goddess Aphrodite was frequently equated with the Iranian water and fertility goddess Anahita.
How does it actually work for the average person on the ground, though? Are they just hedging their bets?
It's more about translation. It allowed diverse populations to worship in the exact same physical temples, looking at the same statues, but interpreting the deity through their own specific cultural lens.
A Greek soldier and a Persian merchant could leave an offering at the same altar, both feeling their specific god had been honored. It created a powerful social glue.
But over time, one specific deity rises above all the rest to become the favorite of the Parthian elite themselves, Mithra.
If we look at why Mithra became the most prominent deity among the Parthian royalty, it makes perfect sense given their martial origins. Mithra is a highly complex god.
He is deeply associated with the sun and fire, but he's also fundamentally the god of contracts, truth, and oaths.
Most importantly for the Parthians, Mithra was specifically depicted in their traditions as a fierce warrior and a horse archer who fought evil under the open skies.
He perfectly aligned with their identity, a god of horse archers for an empire built by horse archers.
But this intense pragmatism and syncretism actually caused serious friction with the strict Orthodox Zoroastrians down in the southern province of Persis.
We actually have an Avestan Zoroastrian text called the Vendidat, and this text specifically labels Parthian territories as evil and corrupted.
Why?
Because the Parthians buried and sometimes burned their dead. This was a massive, unforgivable violation of Orthodox Zoroastrian convention, which required bodies to be exposed to the elements, usually on towers, to be picked clean by birds.
Specifically to avoid polluting the sacred earth or the sacred fire with a corpse.
It highlights perfectly that the Parthians were not strict religious fundamentalists. They were highly pragmatic, continuing their ancestral steppe traditions, even if it offended the local priests.
Which really makes you question the underlying political utility of their famous religious tolerance. Was this inclusivity born out of a genuine philosophical open-mindedness, or was it just a cold, calculated administrative tool?
If you are ruling a massive, volatile empire using a decentralized franchise model, letting people keep their gods seems like the cheapest, easiest way to prevent constant, exhausting religious rebellions.
It was almost certainly the latter. It was a calculated, highly effective strategy of governance. The Parthians simply didn't have the centralized bureaucratic manpower to enforce a single state religion across thousands of miles.
By presenting themselves as the benevolent protectors and patrons of all local faiths, they secured the loyalty of the diverse merchant classes and the powerful local priesthoods.
We see physical evidence of this royal patronage across completely different cults.
For example, look at the recent 224 CE archaeological survey at the Rabbana Merkli fortress, which is located up in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan.
Archaeologists identified a terraced waterfall enclosure and these specific rock-cut niches that are strongly indicative of a major sanctuary dedicated to the Iranian water goddess Anahita.
The Parthian rulers were funneling money into monumental sanctuaries in remote regions to secure local favor.
And simultaneously, hundreds of miles away, you have the famous temple relief in Commagene.
On this massive stone carving, the deity Mithra, who is clearly depicted wearing traditional Persian trousers and a Phrygian cap, is shown physically shaking hands with the local king Antiochus I.
It is a brilliant, undeniable piece of political propaganda showing the deity's direct, equal association with royalty. The Parthian-aligned kings used religion to visibly legitimize their rule to whoever happened to be looking at the monument.
But eventually, even the most flexible systems reach a breaking point. Despite centuries of this brilliant administrative flexibility, unrivaled military dominance, and endless economic wealth from the Silk Road, the empire eventually fractures.
And the very decentralization that allowed them to thrive for 500 years eventually proved to be the exact thing that tore them apart.
It's a very common misconception in popular history that the Roman Empire finally destroyed Parthia. While the Romans certainly fought many brutal, destructive wars with them, frequently marching down the Tigris and sacking the capital city of Ctesiphon in the later centuries, the Parthian Empire did not fall primarily due to Roman incursions.
Rome was a symptom, not the disease. The fatal blows came entirely from internal dynamics.
The franchise model finally broke down. The historical records point to increasingly frequent, devastating civil wars and succession crises between rival branches of the Arsacid royal family.
And these rival claimants were always backed by those powerful 7 great houses.
If the massive private army of the House of Surin supports one brother, and the wealth of the House of Karen supports another, the central authority is completely paralyzed and fatally weakened.
And into this chaotic power vacuum steps a highly ambitious local vassal. In 224 CE, a man named Ardashir I, who was a local ruler down in the province of Persis.
Which, remember, was the traditional ancient heartland of the old Amenid Empire.
He launches a massive organized revolt. He marches his forces north against the final Parthian king of kings, Artabanus IV. They finally meet in a decisive clash at the Battle of Hormuzgan.
Ardashir is completely victorious. Artabanus IV is killed on the battlefield, and Ardashir formally establishes the Sasanian Empire, bringing the nearly 5-century rule of the Arsacids to a very sudden, violent end.
But if we zoom out and look at what actually changed on the ground, did the empire really fall, or did it just undergo a hostile corporate change in management?
If the Arsacids ruled for 5 centuries and they were overthrown by an internal vassal who subsequently kept much of their exact cavalry-based military structure, maintained their administrative framework, and kept the Silk Road trade flowing, it feels more like a dynastic transition than an apocalyptic collapse.
I agree completely. The Sasanian Empire essentially inherited the geopolitical space, the incredibly lucrative Silk Road trade networks, and the foundational tactical cavalry doctrines of the Parthians.
They centralized power more aggressively, certainly, but it was absolutely a dynastic transition.
However, the reason we, in the modern era, so often view it as a total civilization-ending erasure is due to a massive, enduring historiographical bias.
Because almost every single thing we know about the Parthians comes from the written records of the people who hated them the most.
Exactly. There is a severe, highly frustrating scarcity of native Parthian literary texts. No sweeping royal annals, no great philosophical histories written by Parthian scholars have survived the centuries.
We only have fragmentary administrative records.
And this massive literary void allowed Greco-Roman historians, men like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, to completely monopolize the historical narrative for 2,000 years.
And the Romans had a deeply vested political interest in portraying the Parthians as perfidious, untrustworthy Eastern barbarians.
The Roman sources frequently exaggerate the scale of Roman victories, and they heavily emphasize alleged Parthian savagery to explain away their own humiliating catastrophic defeats, like the disaster at Carrhae.
They needed an excuse for why the unstoppable Roman legions kept getting butchered in the desert. So they framed the Parthians as a chaotic, uncultured horde of disorganized nomads, deliberately ignoring the reality that they were highly sophisticated administrators of a vast, complex commercial federation.
But modern archaeology is finally, painstakingly correcting that Roman bias. A perfect example is the discovery of over 2,700 ostraca at the ruins of Old Nisa.
Ostraca are inscribed pieces of broken pottery that were used as cheap, everyday writing material for records.
These fragmented records document meticulous daily wine transactions, massive royal storehouse inventories, and incredibly complex rent farming agreements.
You don't carefully archive 2,700 receipts for wine deliveries and agricultural rent if you were a chaotic horde of illiterate raiders.
It proves undeniably that they had a highly organized, deeply literate bureaucracy operating down at the local day-to-day level. It completely shatters the Roman caricature of the wild nomad.
It forces us to reconsider the entire classical narrative. We have to realize that the Parthians were not just a convenient antagonist or a temporary thorn in Rome's side. They were a highly successful, endlessly adaptive civilization that pioneered a decentralized model of empire that worked effectively for half a millennium.
Which leaves us with a final reflection on the fragile concept of historical memory itself.
The Parthian Empire mastered the art of decentralization, proving beyond a doubt that an empire does not need a micromanaging, suffocating central bureaucracy to endure and thrive for 5 centuries.
They controlled global trade, they fielded armies that broke the Roman war machine, and they built architectural marvels that still stand.
Yet the fact that their legacy has been filtered primarily through the hostile, biased lens of their bitter rivals asks you to deeply question the history books you accept as fact. If an empire this vast, wealthy, and successful can be reduced to a footnote of Eastern barbarians by a handful of Roman historians holding a grudge, you have to wonder how many other effective, radically alternative models of human civilization have been completely erased, minimized, or misunderstood, simply because they didn't write the final history books. It makes you look at that historical jigsaw puzzle and realize we might be forcing the pieces to fit a picture that was drawn by the completely wrong people. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.